Welcome to Session 7, The Powerful versus the Rest of Society. Hello again, Mako.
Hi there, Hayley. You doing well?
I'm doing great.
Good.
What are we talking about today?
We've got the powerful versus the rest of society, which is kind of an angle on the plantation capitalism dynamic that tries to factor in how do plantation elites control the government or other important institutions and influence the rest of society so they can keep extracting wealth and exploiting people and exploiting the planet and just keep the thing running. One kind of touchy question that I wanted to address right off the bat is how political conservatives and also evangelical conservatives use the label of Marxist or communist to do that, to actually trigger fears of like, hey, your profits are decreasing or your way of life is decreasing or you're becoming less powerful, right? And so one of the ways that I thought we could do that is by listening to this clip from CNBC. Jim Cramer is a business journalist who has been following the negotiations, the contract negotiations between the United Auto Workers, their union, and the big three car makers recently, like a couple weeks ago as of this recording. Shawn Fain, who's the union leader, just basically threw the proposed contract into the trash. And he's like, hey, this is not fair. Workers should be making more. And I'm just going to give a little context before we play this clip. Hopefully we can, understand a little bit more of like, what is Jim Cramer afraid of? So the context is that the big three car makers have made $250 billion in profits over the last 10 years, while the majority of auto workers are now lower tier in terms of wages and retirement health care. So in the last 4 years, CEO pay is up 40% and worker pay is up 6%. CNN Business itself at the end of July 2023 said GM's earnings have soared. The Detroit News at the end of July reports that Stellantis, the maker of Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram vehicles, posted a $12.1 billion profit in the first half of 2023, right? And Stellantis' CEO, Carlos Tavares, saw his earnings go up by 72% since 2019. 72%. Ford had their second quarter profits surge as earnings topped estimates. And General Motors CEO Mary Barra made $29 million last year, while a frontline newly hired battery worker makes $16.50 an hour. So that worker would have to work 16 years to make 1 week of CEO pay. All of these things, like Shawn Fain has highlighted, there still might be a strike, come mid-September when that might happen. It would be one of the biggest strikes in history. And if you want to know more, you could look for David Dole at the Rational National, covering Jim Cramer, or Crystal Ball at Breaking Points. I've really appreciated their perspective on this. But for our purpose, we just want to highlight the fact that Jim Cramer insinuates that Shawn Fain is like a Marxist and a communist.
If Shawn Fain, who is the UAW head, if he gets his way, you can short every single auto company until the cows come home. I took 7 courses on communism at Harvard because I was in a particularly bad period at Harvard. There should be an 8th course, Shawn Fain, and what he had to do with Engels. It was Marx and Engels and Fain.
So, why do we bring up this example? First of all, because Jim Cramer is just a television journalist, right? Yeah. And when you see it, when you see him, someone like him doing this, then you're like, wait a minute, and let's try to take it out of the realm of politics and just look at it from a human behavior standpoint. Like, what is he trying to do? What reaction is he trying to provoke in me? And then if that's true there, though, where else is it true? And so we cite this example because we want to talk about 2 things. First, elites, like economic elites especially, versus the rest of society. Like, how do the rich use rhetoric, government, law, policy, and other institutions like the media to exploit other people? But then secondly, we also wanted to ask, how do evangelicals do that? How do evangelicals And here's the touchy thing. They tend to side with the wealthy versus the rest of society. And so
Right.
this is why Christians are vulnerable to fascism. Now, we're going to define that later, I know. But when anyone calls anyone else like a Marxist or a communist, like they don't even have to define it that well,
No.
like because their alarm bells kind of going off, and people watching are supposed to also feel the same way.
Right. If you scream that person's a Marxist in a real anxious voice, then you have this tendency welling up in you to go, no, I'm not. What is it even? Are we defining this? Does it have any meaning?
Right. I thought, hey, Jim Cramer, I thought being a Marxist and communist means that you believe the state should own like the means of production, right? Or something like that. But a labor union negotiating with their bosses, like I thought that's not even a state issue.
Right. A bunch of individual workers talking to their also not a part of the government individual company is not state-owned companies. It's
right.
It doesn't coincide with reality.
Right. If you're for non-governmental action, then labor unions are like number one good thing on your list. Or it
absolute
should be.
Peak non-governmental action. Lots of people together who are vulnerable and workers and want to have something better for their lives in a successful company.
Exactly.
There's also a video that we recently saw from More Perfect Union, in which a guy goes to some Trump supporters at a rally and finds some common ground with them because he's worked at bars and served drinks to Trump supporters. And he reaches this place of agreement where they would like to place some limitations on oligarchies. And they think that it's fair that if a company is earning a ton of money, that workers should have a pretty significant stake in that. Maybe some form of worker-owned companies. So we've got this consensus that can come from the left and the right.
Right. The slogan for the UAW has been record profits, record contracts. Like, why can't workers share proportionally in the record profits? So absolutely.
Yeah. And I think about that clip of Jim Cramer on his, I mean, I think it's called Mad Money. Is that what his thing is called? So
yeah,
which is a little concerning and feels a little bit on fire. And then all of that, one of the graphics in that, or something that they show on the screen, is like the S&P heat map, and everything's flashing and it's red and some things are green and the numbers are changing so much by every second. And then they have this aggressive screen wipe and it goes back to the guys, as if this is something that you should be feeling, that sense of panic and chaos, this emotional contagion. These numbers should be triggering something in you. And I think of emotional contagion with someone like Jim Cramer going onto Wall Street and thinking that like this is a measure of the health of America. If that graph goes up, the S&P goes up, the stocks are better. And I think about, it's mainly older people who are owning stocks and who are benefiting from dividends from the stock market. I mean, I have $50 on Robinhood, probably less now, just because I was like, what's this? Let's see what this is. But I don't own stocks. And many of those in my millennial cohort don't, because we're living paycheck to paycheck. We don't have money to play around with that sort of thing. And so we're talking about older people who are watching a guy who's about their age on a screen with some scary flashing lights. And again, the contagious on fire emotions, which are dangerous for people who, as they get older, as all people do, begin to experience some level of cognitive impairment and more susceptibility to this concept of emotional contagion, which is the tendency to automatically mimic and synchronize expressions, vocalizations, postures, and movements with those of another person's, and consequently to converge emotionally.
Wow. Where is that from? Yeah, that's a juicy quote.
Yeah, that's from a 1993 paper by Hatfield, Cacioppo, and Rapson in there.
Didn't Adam Smith have something to say about this?
He did. He said he was talking about, he wouldn't have had these words, but using your mirror neurons to sense along with people thinking again about the heat map of the S&P and Jim Cramer, sort of decompensating on the screen there. Adam Smith said, though our brother is upon the rack, by imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them.
That is so powerful. Oh my goodness.
Be careful what you watch. Be careful what you hear.
That's right. And
be discriminating.
Yes. I mean, there's a basic level of empathy and identification that Adam Smith is talking about. That's really important. I know this comes from his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he believed was essential reading if you were going to also read his book, The Wealth of Nations. And yet, how many people only read Wealth of Nations and talk about self-interest and individualism? Here he's talking about an identification relationally with other people. And it's not Marxist or communist to be relational, right? I mean, and this is the thing.
We shouldn't have to say this out loud. We really shouldn't have to say this.
We should not have to say it. But it's sad that we do. We wanted to start by reflecting on the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21 in Scripture, and what this ties to, because this is a really good biblical example of someone who's powerful using their power to try to take his neighbor's stuff. And so, Hayley, would you mind reading 1 Kings 21 verses 1 through 7?
Sure. Later, the following events took place. Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard in Jezreel, beside the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. And Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard so that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near my house. I will give you a better vineyard for it, or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you my ancestral inheritance. Ahab went home resentful and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him, for he had said, I will not give you my ancestral inheritance. He lay down on his bed, turned away his face, and would not eat. His wife Jezebel came to him and said, why are you so depressed that you will not eat? He said to her, because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard for it. But he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. His wife Jezebel said to him, do you now govern Israel? Get up, eat some food and be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.
Thank you. Ooh, this story. It says so much about some of these dynamics. What stands out to me is Naboth refers to his vineyard as my ancestral inheritance. But when King Ahab tells his wife, Queen Jezebel, about why he's pouty and what Naboth said, he says, I will not give you my vineyard. That's what Naboth says. So he reduces it, or the way he thinks about it, or maybe the way he wants Jezebel to think about it is, it's just a piece of land. It's not, it's not connected to like my ancestors. And as we've been talking about in Jesus's Jubilee economy and how Israel was kind of a precursor to that, their expression of Jubilee was, look, family and land go together. Like God presses an economic reset button every 50 years so that people go back to their lands return to the people if it's been sold and things like that. And so the Israelites were not supposed to sell their land this way. And it was a vision. It was God's vision of Israel being a new version of Adam and Eve in the garden land, and every family kind of having their little portion of the garden land. King Ahab is trying to be a plantation capitalist, a plantation elite who just thinks of other people's property, not with God involved, not with other people involved, not with ancestors, not with children. It's just, look, it's just a piece of property, right? And I should be able to do something to you or to it to get it.
Right. So this is Isaiah 5, verse 8. Woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there is room for no one.
Oh man, that just sounds like him.
Yeah.
Like Ahab.
And then Micah chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. Woe to those who covet fields and seize them, houses, and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance.
Yeah, I mean, what you pointed out is this seems to be a direct commentary on what King Ahab wants to do, and later what Queen Jezebel does. Fascinating that Micah says they oppress householder and house. Like there's a way to oppress the house, like the object.
Right.
But in any case, yeah, the early church understood this, and there was an early bishop in the 4th century, Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose mentored Augustine, in some ways was important to leading Augustine to Christian faith. Milan was the Wall Street of the ancient Roman Empire. I mean, it was where the emperors during that time lived. And so you have a bunch of grifters, right? Like trying to get special favors by living near the emperor, get a lot of wealth pouring in, and a lot of landholders that were also displacing the poor. And so Ambrose has this sermon, which we'll link to. It's called On Naboth. And he says, this is happening, and God condemns it. So
you're saying when we see Ambrose of Milan, we should think Ambrose of Wall Street, because that has the correct connotation for us, and that will change.
Absolutely. Saying you're robbing people of their ancestral inheritance. So the question especially of like, how do Christians get into the position where they feel like they're in a special position to have more power and wealth than other people? Like that, I think that's an important thing to talk about. So we've got to mention Puritans like John Cotton, who had a sermon called God's Promise to His Plantations, which was his attempt at developing a theology of displacement of one people by another. He did this by universalizing parts of the story of Israel, but not others, and essentially saying, this is how the English can take native lands. And then we've mentioned John Winthrop, who preached a sermon called The Model of Christian Charity. That's where the idea of the city on a hill comes from, when he was thinking about Massachusetts and Boston being a light to the world, like the way the Puritans lived. Winthrop and the Puritans recognized that it's not fair for us to just take this land, but then God could give it to us. And that's how they
convenient.
thought about it.
That's very convenient. I like that. I'm going to be doing that all over now.
Right. Just walk into your neighbor's house and say, I think God is giving me your house.
Like, it is wrong for me to take this from you, but I'll have you know that God gave it to me. So get out. Yeah.
While he enslaved 3 Pequot people, while they excluded Native Americans, even if they came to Christ.
Right. There's a theme of being chosen and called, and then working very hard for your plantation, for your city on a hill here, which doesn't feel quite right.
So I think, it's this sense of evangelical American exceptionalism that makes Christians very afraid of facing facts, facing the truth. And so they're quick to accuse other people of being Marxist. I wanted to go through a quick list of like, how did people start talking that way? So in some sense,
brief history of everyone who's Marxist. Let's go.
Yeah.
According to evangelicals.
According to evangelicals. So Northerners, right? After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, they were socialists. Right?
There we go.
It's the white Southerners who called the Northerners socialists. Like you've got this big government stuff. Never mind that we try to use big government to enforce runaway slave acts and, like to maintain our property.
Yeah.
But you guys are big government socialists. And then after World War II, white evangelicals from the time of Eisenhower sided against, quote unquote, godless communism, right? Because the USSR and the US were in a Cold War. So Kristen Kobes-Dumais, in her book, Jesus and John Wayne, shows how this especially influenced Christian ideas of masculinity and what a Christian man was or should be. And it had a lot more to do with John Wayne than with Jesus.
So Jesus is a Marxist and a socialist as well. John Wayne isn't, at minimum. He's
Right.
safe.
Well,
Okay.
John Wayne is the rugged individualist, right?
Okay.
Who doesn't
Perfect.
depend on government to defend him from enemies or shoot his gun. Anyway,
John Wayne was an actor. His characters weren't real.
well, Hollywood was playing along, right? I think wasn't this around the time when Cecil B. DeMille made those movies, the Ten Commandments and other things? So Hollywood was happy to collaborate in this kind of national identity building.
Who else? Who else is a Marxist and a socialist? We want them all.
MLK was called a Marxist and a socialist,
Of course.
especially by white evangelicals and the CIA and FBI. And, they wanted to discredit him. So, again, like he was like, no, we're just continuing on from the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, right, in 1954, which said racial discrimination is unconstitutional. And the way that this is all playing out with unequal schools and unequal property values and the funding for schools. But instead, the John Birch Society was founded in 1958 with big bucks from Fred Koch. And, they were quick to use the accusation, you're a Marxist, you're a communist.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the alt-right or far-right or white supremacists today use the label cultural Marxism, to accuse people of, I guess, leftist thought. And so there's a paper by Tanner Mearleys, The Alt-Right's Discourse of Cultural Marxism, that we just wanted to give a shout out to.
Okay. Who else?
Well, what's really disturbing is that the Utah man who wanted to use his sniper rifle to assassinate President Biden did so because he thought Biden is a Marxist. Why? Because Trump told him that he's a Marxist, right? So the man's name is Craig Robertson. During Biden's visit to Utah on August 9th, 2023, just before that, he had posted on Facebook asking whether, quote unquote, asking whether the state will become famous as the place a sniper took out Biden the Marxist. And he urged his fellow Utahns to fire their guns into the air when Air Force One arrived. That was after Donald Trump repeatedly called Biden a Marxist. So Craig Robertson also threatened Kamala Harris, Attorney General Merrick Garland, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Why? Because he believed Trump. And Robertson described himself as a MAGA Trumper.
Wow. So Joe Biden as well, we're adding this to the list, who is a Marxist and a socialist. Great. Right.
Even though Biden hasn't mentioned public option for healthcare.
No, he's not nationalizing a bunch of stuff that we don't really see that happening.
No. So but it just goes to show this is just a label that people throw around. It's a fear-mongering tactic. And I just wanted to highlight for anyone skeptical about this pattern that Trump's rhetoric has a lot to do with the stochastic violence of his followers. So back in August 2020, while the presidential campaign was going on, Trump resorted to a common campaign strategy, which was tarring Biden as influenced by radical socialist Marxists, right? He said, Biden is a Trojan horse for socialism. If Joe Biden doesn't have the strength to stand up to wild-eyed Marxists like Bernie Sanders and his fellow radicals, then how is he ever going to stand up for you? The idea being, like, Biden himself is not a Marxist, but there are people in the Democratic Party who are, like Bernie, even though Bernie's not. So, but then as recently as March 1st, 2023, this is what Raw Story says. In another campaign video outlining his agenda, Donald Trump falsely accuses President Joe Biden of creating a, quote, Marxist equity enforcement squad for the executive branch. Like, what is that? And promises if voters return him to the Oval Office, he will, quote, immediately terminate all staffers and programs associated with Biden's, quote, woke takeover of the entire federal government. And then on June 30th in Philadelphia, Donald Trump slammed the radical left, quote unquote, who, quote, hate God during the Moms for Liberty Summit, and he urged conservative mothers to be activists on behalf of their children, saying he wants to, quote, liberate our children from the Marxist lunatics and perverts who have infested our educational system. Trump vowed a day one executive order to cut federal funding to any school pushing, quote unquote, critical race theory, transgender, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content. And then in August 1st, a new Trump ad called Biden a corrupt third world dictator. So his rhetoric has just been increasing. He has some responsibility for this. I mean, this gets us to the touchy question, is Trump himself a fascist? So here's where, you know, and then we're going to talk about evangelical support for Trump. Now, a basic definition of fascism is it's anti-democratic and authoritarian. It draws upon populist impulses to demonize a minority, or a nationalist impulse to demonize outsiders, or people who might feel like they have a community connection to people in other countries, right? Like Jews or Catholics, or quote unquote globalists. And then those people are to blame for why you feel bad. And so fascists also demonstrate disdain for the media because they think of themselves as the only legitimate source of knowledge, and they draw upon the wealthy for funding. So I know we'll get to this later, but fascism comes from the right because they always eventually ally themselves with the business class.
Right.
So there's some scholars of fascism and or white Christian nationalism that we've read and really appreciated. Their work is so important for these days. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, spelled Ghiat, has a book called Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present, from 2020, and that is really important. And she's been interviewed on a lot of shows. Folks, look her up, please, and listen to what she's saying. Philip Gorski has a book called The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy, in 2022. He says, quote, the U.S. cannot be both a truly multiracial democracy, a people of people and a nation of nations, and a white Christian nation at the same time. This is why white Christian nationalism has become a serious threat to American democracy, perhaps the most serious threat it now faces. Other books. Catherine Stewart, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, 2019. Ann Nelson, Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. She gets to the details of, like, when did these people meet? When did evangelicals meet with the big oil executives? Sarah Posner, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. John Fea, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump. Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And Kristen Kobus-Dumais, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. That's a lot, but I just want folks to know there's been a lot of historical work on this. Yeah. Now, Hayley, you and I came across an article by Christopher R. Browning, A New Kind of Fascism, in The Atlantic. Who is this, and why did this article catch our attention?
Well, he says, I guess he was saying for a long time he was resisting using the word fascism, and he is an expert because he is the Frank Porter Graham Professor of History Emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the author of The Origins of the Final Solution, The Evolution of Nazi Jewish Policies, September 1939 to March 1942. So, you know, the last time we were fighting fascism, he wrote the book on it, so he's an expert, and so, you know, we need to wait for this man to tell us that Trump is a fascist, and I don't care. I don't care what this guy says. He is on the way out. He has nothing to lose. He's an old white guy, and nothing will happen to him. So I think of the phrase cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits in fascism? Is it me? Is it me who benefits from fascism? No, it's not. This guy has nothing to lose. I do. And he said that, you know, Trump's not really a fascist because he wasn't trying to invade other countries. You have to be invading other countries. But I think he has said that at this point.
He totally has. I mean, when he was president, he wanted to buy Greenland. which was
Mhm.
ridiculous. But now, as a candidate, again, he has said he wants to invade Mexico because of drug cartel activity.
Mm.
And that has so played into the trope of scapegoating Mexicans and blaming them and blaming the cartels for our, fentanyl addictions and all these things, that people are willing to believe that. And now almost all, if not all, GOP presidential candidates have fallen in line. They agree that the US should unilaterally invade Mexico, even though the Mexican government has said, no, we do not support this.
Mhm.
It's ridiculous.
Right.
So
It's
on that sole criteria, yeah, like this guy said, well, I guess Trump didn't want to invade other countries like Mussolini and Hitler did, so I'm not going to call him a fascist. Well,
Mhm.
now that he actually is advocating for invading another country, like our strongest trade partner, our closest neighbor, the people we really need as our friends.
Mm.
What do you have to say now, Christopher Browning?
It's kind of bonkers crazy to be like, just throw out, let's invade Mexico. It's something that would have been a joke on Saturday Night Live a few years ago. And now everybody's just doing it. And everyone's lost the sense of sanity of seeing how insane that is. Invading Mexico. I mean, fentanyl is a problem. Drugs are a problem. Overdoses are a problem. They're affecting a lot of white people. It's hard. You want to help the drug problem? Get a degree, do the addictions work in the communities. It's really, really hard work. Who's buying the drugs in America? I'm not walking around tripping on drugs accidentally because Mexico is coming and hiding them in the bushes or something.
Mhm.
So it's insane to say, let's bomb Mexico. Let's stop people from wanting to have and needing to have drugs here.
Plus, I thought this was the party of personal responsibility, right? So people who are taking
Yeah.
drugs, like, shouldn't they just be blaming them?
Right. So
Like,
why are we bombing a country who's our neighbor to the south? And like, where's Ted Cruz going to go for vacation when we're bombing Mexico? Won't somebody think of
exactly.
Ted Cruz? Come on. We can't bomb Mexico. That's insane. Again, we shouldn't have to say this.
Don't do that to Ted Cruz.
Poor guy. The next time Texas's power grid fails, poor Ted Cruz will be like trying to look up tickets to Cancun and go, I bombed Mexico. He's going to have to find somewhere else to go.
He has a friend in DeSantis, so maybe he'll just go to Florida. Now, well, I mean, we're laughing about it, but I think we really have to take it seriously. Like the characteristics of fascism are lining up. And, one of the most scary ones today is the threat of political violence. Trump supporters are threatening other people with political violence. And it's a lot like the black shirts of Mussolini or the brown shirts of Hitler's youth. Hitler was imitating Mussolini. Here are some examples. First, on August 4th, 2023, Trump personally posted on his Truth Social, "If you come for me, I'm coming for you." And he has lied about Fani Willis, the Fulton County DA that's prosecuting the Georgia case, Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA prosecuting the hush money payment case. So NBC News says, quote, after Trump was indicted in a hush money case in New York in March, he warned of, quote, potential death and destruction and criticized potential death and destruction, criticizing Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, a Democrat whom he called an animal. Just want to point out, Alvin Bragg is black. And so the racist tropes that he's using should be loud and clear. Trump and his allies have also disparaged Juan Merchan, the state judge presiding over the hush money case. Ahead of his court appearance in April, Trump called Merchan a highly partisan judge and said Merchan and his family were Trump haters. This is while he's saying, or his lawyer is saying, that he wants trial moved to diverse West Virginia.
Are you still going to pursue a change of venue?
Absolutely. We would like a diverse venue, a diverse jury.
Do you have any expectation that will be granted?
That reflects the characteristics of the American people. It's up to the judge. I think West Virginia would be an excellent venue to try this case.
Which has a 92% white population, because West Virginia has a more representative American population.
No, and the way that they mean it, they're right. What
Yeah.
they think actual America is.
This is real America.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sarah Palin's old language. But this is really dangerous. 2 articles from August 16th, 2023, just a couple days ago, say Trump supporters post names and addresses of Georgia grand jurors online. That is dangerous. That is irresponsible. That is vindictive. And then in Texas, a woman named Abigail Jo Schrei called the chambers of Judge Tanya Chutkan on August 5th and left a voicemail message threatening to kill anyone who went after former President Trump. The death threats also allegedly included racist comment against Chutkan, who is Black. Prosecutors said in court filings that Schrei called the judge a stupid slave N-word in the voicemail. Oh my gosh. Right? His rhetoric is stirring up this random violence, stochastic violence, but that's part of the point. And we can't forget, just a few months ago, a QAnon supporting man broke into the home of Paul and Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco and bashed Paul Pelosi over the head. He's an elderly man. And he was looking for Nancy Pelosi, who he wanted to torture in her own home. And then in the early morning of January 6th, there was a man in the gray hoodie who was never caught, right? But he showed up on camera placing pipe bombs outside the offices of the DNC and RNC, yet to be identified, yet to be caught. So yeah, I mean, this is why fascism takes the form that it's authoritarian, it's anti-democratic, trying to intimidate people.
And the key here is that evangelicals overwhelmingly support this team, this side. You might catch one and be like, do you support political violence? They might say, of course not, but the numbers don't lie, they do.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen.
Let's all say a prayer in this sacred space.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Let me take it back. Thank you, Heavenly Father.
Amen.
For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs.
Do we have a history of this?
We have, sadly, a long history of white evangelicals siding with the fascists. So in the U.S. Civil War, most folks in the South stuck up for the South and their, quote, way of life, which depended on slavery. But what we're less familiar with, I think, is that people in the North sided with the South. And so in Boston, there was these merchants, and they were cotton merchants largely. They had Senator Jefferson Davis come up to speak in Faneuil Hall, in Boston's Faneuil Hall in 1860, and they gave him a standing ovation. So on the eve of the Civil War, with all the tensions and all of the struggle between the sections of the country, this is what Boston cotton merchants believed and felt, because their business depended on slave-grown cotton. Right? They were building out Lowell and Lawrence and these places to plant the cotton mills. And then in 1861, when the South declared their secession, the mayor of New York City said New York City should go and secede with the South. That's crazy.
That would have been hard to do, just the city. Go on with this. How would you do that? That's bonkers.
No, Hayley, these are just little play lines that we just draw, right? Like, this is what an article from history.com says. Mayor Fernando Wood believed Black people were racially inferior and regarded slavery as a, quote, divine institution. Sadly, many New Yorkers had a similar view of slavery, or at least a high regard for the profits to be made from it. New York belongs almost as much to the South as to the North, observed the editor of the New York Evening Post. The city's businessmen marketed the South's cotton crop and manufactured everything from cheap clothing for outfitting slaves to fancy carriages for their masters. Wood himself called the South, quote, our best customer. She pays the best prices and pays promptly. Wood's political base included the city's gentry and businessmen who made their living from the slave industry, as well as the working class, whose jobs would be threatened by freedmen surging north. The mayor was not far wrong when he claimed, quote, the profits, luxuries, the necessities, nay, even the physical existence of New York depend upon continuance of slave labor and the prosperity of the slave master. New York was not only a major commercial supply hub for the South legal institution of slavery, it was, and had been for many years, the epicenter of America's illegal slave trade. Although the state of New York had voted in 1827 to abolish slavery, New York City traders continued to provide slaves, first to the South, then to Brazil and Cuba, right up to and during the Civil War. Whether as investors, ship owners, or captains and crews, New Yorkers promoted, enabled, and carried on the traffic in humans. Of all the cities in America, New York was the most invested in the transatlantic slave trade. New York's shipbuilders built their vessels to accommodate large slave cargoes. Its businessmen financed and invested in the voyages, and its seamen made the trips. The profits realized from a single slaving expedition were staggering. A slave purchased for $40 worth of cloth, beads, or whiskey would sell for between $400 and $1,200 on the blocks of Charleston, Mobile, Rio de Janeiro, or Havana, with the sale of an average cargo of 800 slaves bringing as much as $960,000, a sum equaling tens of millions in today's currency. Many a shipowner, investor, and captain grew wealthy from the proceeds of a single successful voyage.
You're saying that cui bono, who benefits? If you follow
benefits?
the money,
Follow the money.
then they want slavery. We've spoken about this before, why it's beneficial. And we're saying that evangelicals are lining up with this and saying that they want these strong men, that they want this slavery heresy to continue. And it's not just the South, the geographic South of the United States. It's Boston and New York City.
Right. Exactly. And then after the Civil War and during and after Reconstruction, there was such strong efforts to once again side with the fascists. Now, the lost cause myth took hold. So folks want to chase that down. Charles Reagan, baptized in blood, and Edward J. Blum, reforging the white republic, show the importance of white Southern evangelicalism and in different forms and different denominations towards rebuilding all that. Dwight L. Moody played a role. And then a really good paper by Elizabeth L. Jemison, Pro-Slavery Christianity After the Emancipation, lists white evangelicals who supported slavery while they were trying to defend the inerrancy of Scripture, right? So Princeton Seminary, again, up north, did that at least until the late 1800s, that Charles Hodge, one of the presidents, said, basically, if you want to defend the inerrancy of Scripture, you have to defend slavery, right? And so, we were wrong about what we did to the South. And then the Southern Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, they were all saying, look, the South was right.
You're telling me that this is deeply linked to American expressions of Christianity.
Absolutely.
Not just the geographic South, not just Southern Baptists.
Right.
It's bigger.
Right. It's way bigger. Again, I mean, some people were led to believe this because of maybe they genuinely thought, okay, I guess I have to defend Scripture by defending slavery. But a lot of it also depended on where the money came from and how it got to seminaries, denominations, big organizations, right?
So what about later on? I'm thinking about World War II, and I'm thinking about who I really like is Smedley Butler. When I've read quotes from War is a Racket, and I have his book here, it's captivating. His words are absolutely captivating. I'll read the opening part of chapter 1. It's just from the very beginning, it just captivates me. Yes. He says, war is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. Go
Yep.
read the rest. It's wonderful.
We ought to do a book discussion group on that book. It's so relevant.
And you've got some info about him or not him, as the case may be.
Yes. So I became aware of him just a few years ago because there was a group of businessmen and anti-New Deal politicians who wanted Smedley Butler to lead a coup, a fascist coup on Washington, D.C., made up of veterans to overthrow Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, it is just amazing. So once again, and those are not like just our words, right? Smedley Butler himself testified before Congress because he was a whistleblower. He did not want to do this, but he was
absolutely.
And that's what makes him such an interesting person.
Right.
But you know what? I love that he basically spoiled the whole fascist coup plot. Right. And of course, there are similarities to the Jan 6 insurrection and things. So
yes,
who wanted Smedley Butler to lead this fascist coup?
Tell us, please tell us.
Oh my gosh, there's a long list. So there's a group called the American Liberty League, which was founded in 1934. It was made up of...
Wait, that sounds like such a nice thing, the American Liberty League.
I know,
it sounds
right?
wonderful. Who are the people who are in the American Liberty League, which is fascist? Please tell us.
Alfred P. Sloan, the then CEO of General Motors, J.P. Morgan Jr. of J.P. Morgan Bank and the Morgan family, Irene DuPont, the previous CEO of the DuPont Company, the massive chemical manufacturer.
Yikes.
A bunch of Wall Street folks, Gerald C. McGuire, who is a Wall Street bond dealer working for Grayson Mellor Provost Murphy, a guy who headed up a Wall Street firm. Grayson Murphy was personally named by Smedley Butler in his testimony as like, hey, this guy was involved. Yeah. J. Howard Pugh of Sun Oil Company.
Oops.
Yep. There's Big Oil. But Pugh doesn't just represent big oil. He represents big Christianity. And he embodies the convergence of those two things. So Pugh later became co-founder of the Pew Charitable Trusts. We probably are all familiar with that. He was also an early donor to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Massachusetts. He was one of the founders. He worked with Billy Graham and evangelical pastor Harold Ockenga to get it started. Pugh was a donor to causes that were Christian, libertarian, and far right. Notice that combination. He was involved with the American Liberty League in the 1930s. Pugh was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was a group started in 1947 by Austrian economists like Friedrich Hayek and made up of neoliberal economists, philosophers, historians, intellectuals, and business leaders. He gave to FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which is a libertarian group. Then in 1956, he funded the formation of Christianity Today, the magazine, with Billy Graham. In 1958, he donated to the Liberty Lobby. The Liberty Lobby was a far-right think tank and lobby group. Its founder was known for his promotion of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, white nationalism, Holocaust denialism. This should sound familiar to us. In 1964, Pugh supported Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign. Goldwater was an Arizona politician. He ran as a Republican who rejected the New Deal. And that's significant because it was an early precursor to Reagan. Goldwater represented the perspective of business that ran extractive industries from the land, from the South to the West. Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, specifically Title II and Title VII. Title II was about public accommodations, making sure that people of color were able to benefit from transportation, hotels, and gas stations. Title VII was about equal employment opportunities. So these are the things that Goldwater opposed, which ostensibly J. Howard Pugh also opposed, at least. Right? This is just one example, but he is a prominent example. John Howard Pugh represented the merger of business interests and Christian faith in America. How did he express that? Through causes that were libertarian and far right. There's Al Smith and John W. Davis, who were anti-New Deal Democrats who wanted to oppose FDR. And then there were some media people. So the New York Times ran an article ridiculing Butler, and we'll put a graphic of that up. And then Time Magazine, which also kind of poked fun at Butler, saying like he doesn't know what he's talking about. And this is really interesting because Time Magazine was at the time run by Henry Luce, who's the billionaire son of Presbyterian missionaries to China. Henry Luce, according to a biography by George Marsden, took his faith seriously all his life. And so here's an example. Quote, after World War II, Luce became concerned, as were a number of public intellectuals of the time, to find a higher law that could guide nations and perhaps unite the world. He was unhappy with the sort of relativism that he saw in the pragmatic conception of the law of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He was also unhappy with the realpolitik of the Truman administration and argued that, quote, the struggle between freedom and communism, there it is again, the struggle between freedom and communism is at bottom a moral issue, a religious issue.
Wow.
So, you know, and that was part of what Luce saw as his role of helping craft a national purpose among American citizens after World War II. And then we'll talk about the Dulles brothers, who in another segment of Plantation Capitalism, they were Christians and they basically ran U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
So the participation of Christians in support of a fascist movement, you would think this is so weird because during World War II we were fighting the fascists, right? Like we shouldn't be fascists,
right?
And yet I want to just highlight a few other data points about this, because Smedley Butler's testimony before Congress was kind of mocked. But in that same year, Peter A. Green of Six Companies Incorporated, who they were involved in building the Hoover Dam, he wrote to this congressional subcommittee investigating the plot to tell them that in March 1933, he'd been approached by two men claiming to be part of an organization called the American Fascist Veterans Association.
Oops. Don't be that.
Yeah. You know, maybe not put it in your group name.
Yeah.
But Green was the vice commander of the Boulder City American Legion post, so he was a veteran. And he said the men inquired as to whether he'd be interested in leading the Western wing of their fascist enterprise. Green says in his letter that he was told that Butler was already on board with the plot, in addition to the veterans of foreign wars.
Well, I'm mad about that because I love Smedley Butler. Was he?
No. They were misrepresenting Butler. But you can see, like, and what is weird is it's even among veterans who had fought fascists.
Right. What were they doing? What? You learn nothing. Stop.
Exactly. Why would we want that here?
Right.
But again, there were business interests that were aligning with the Nazis.
Right.
So Prescott Bush was a senator. He was the father of George H.W. Bush, grandfather of George W. Bush. He was already involved with the Nazi Party. He helped them basically launder their money and support one of the business tycoons of Nazi Germany.
Oops.
Yeah.
I always say that a lot. Oops.
Yeah, there are some big oopses that why don't we highlight this more? You know, and then as one example, IBM sold technology to Nazi Germany to do like punch card technology, to do census taking, registering of Jews, Roma, and other ethnic groups. They helped Nazi Germany run logistics for their military and concentration camps and managing train traffic. And then IBM owned this subsidiary in Germany called Dehomag. They owned 90% of that company. They gave Hitler counting machine technology, and the chief executive of Dehomag was an enthusiastic supporter of the Hitler regime. Amazing. So once again, fascism comes from the right, and then evangelicals get tied in for different reasons to it and wind up supporting the regime.
Right. Well, I think about when we linked together big business, big money, and religion and government and all of that. Kevin Cruz wrote in One Nation Under God stories about Billy Graham being embraced and in partnership with big businesses with oil money. There was a notable part in it where Billy Graham went and he met with this group of business leaders and he prayed for all of them. At the end of it, he said, because, you know, in honor of the place that he was at and all of them, he said, and God bless the Holiday Inn, which is where he was. And that too is something that it's like something out of a SNL skit to have like some religious preachers legitimately end his prayer saying, God bless the Holiday Inn. What? Yeah. Conrad Hilton was contacted. He's the guy who started Hilton Hotels, contacted by religious leaders, and they were looking to blend together government leaders and religion at the what became the National Prayer Breakfast. Mm-hmm. And so we have, this is in like the 1950s, the language in the 1950s, the time where everybody now is like, if only we could go back to the 1950s, right? The language then was like hand-wringing over the moral decline that was happening and how we need to return to our Christian foundation. That's what they were saying in the 1950s when everybody was staying at home or every woman was staying at home wearing high heels and vacuuming all day long. So they had it and it wasn't good enough.
It wasn't good enough. Yeah. Mm. And so in 1954, they had to add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance.
Only in 1954. It didn't happen before that. That was recently.
And then in God we trust to our currency. I mean, they're falsifying a history. Mm. And by the way, I mean, it's just really interesting that look at U.S. history as a conflict between Christians, right? I mean, because the slavery versus abolition, that was kind of Christian versus Christian. Mm-hmm. Going back further than that, there was Roger Williams versus John Winthrop. That was Christian versus Christian, about the role of Christian faith in public life and the role of Native Americans and non-Christians in the polity, right, in the community. What do we think about land? The difference in Christian opinion. And then even during the New Deal and that time frame, FDR would quote from the Gospels. He would appeal especially to Catholic voters. But at the same time, there was this guy named James Fifield who tried to fuse Christianity and libertarianism. And he worked to gather all these like business leaders, especially Christian business leaders, to say, yeah, Christianity and libertarianism go hand in hand, because he hated the New Deal. But essentially it leads to this, now that, kind of Christians were not fighting each other over slavery and abolition, like maybe we can falsify our history. And so at the time, again, in the 1950s, as Kristen Kobus-Dumais points out, there was this vision of Christian masculinity that kind of took hold. This is what it means to support our nation in the Cold War. It's to be anti-communist. And so the danger of being anti anything so much is that you lose sight of actually what Jesus really said. So, two data points on this, which are really important. Hitler in Mein Kampf argued that effeminate Jewish Christian ethics were enfeebling Europe, and that Germany was in need of an uncompromising strongman to restore itself and build an empire.
That sounds really familiar and recent.
It is familiar and recent because Russell Moore just was interviewed by NPR, and he said that, let me read the quote. It was the result of having multiple pastors tell me essentially the same story about quoting the Sermon on the Mount in their preaching, turn the other cheek, and to have someone come up after to say, where did you get those liberal talking points? What was alarming to me is that in most of those scenarios, when the pastor would say, I'm literally quoting Jesus Christ, the response would not be, I apologize. The response would be, yes, but that doesn't work anymore. That's weak.
Oops.
Another oops. Yeah, I mean, doesn't that just sound like Hitler saying effeminate Jewish Christian ethics are enfeebling Europe?
Right.
We need to get beyond turn the other cheek.
Right.
Yeah.
I have no words. I have no words for how horrendous that is and how dark that makes the prospects of America seem, how darkened somebody must be to hear like, hey, I'm quoting Jesus to you, and them to be like, well, that doesn't work. It's weak.
Right.
Who do you think you are?
Right. Exactly. Let's be the judge of Jesus.
Right.
And this is not just anecdotal data. I mean, there was a poll conducted by CBS News and YouGov over August 16th to 18th of 2023, and they asked Trump voters, who do you feel tells you the truth? 71% said Donald Trump himself. 63% said friends and family, and that compares with only 56% of conservative media figures and only 42% of religious leaders. I guess that includes Jesus too. 71% of Trump voters trust Donald Trump to tell them the truth.
Why are evangelicals doing this? How do they get to this point where someone rolls a fascism train by them and they are enticed by this and follow along?
Well, let's look deeper at that next time as we tackle part 2 of session 7, The Powerful and the Rest of Society. Thank you to our audience for joining us and looking at plantation capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee economy.